The haunted house in Ashwood. It was supposed to be just another adventure. Sarah, Mike, and Emily were urban explorers, always seeking the thrill of forgotten places to document for their YouTube channel. Their latest destination, the Ashwood House, known among locals as the House of Shadows. It had a sinister reputation. Strange lights at night, inexplicable noises, and rumors of disappearances over the years had given it legendary status. "We'll be the first to capture the truth," Emily said, adjusting her camera. Her voice was confident, but her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Mike scoffed. "I'm telling you, there's nothing in there but dust and rats. People just like to scare themselves with stories." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Her grandmother used to tell her bedtime stories about the Ashwood House, warning her to never go near it. "Bad things happen there," her grandmother would whisper, her eyes distant. Despite the warnings, curiosity got the better of them. The house loomed before them, an ancient structure with crumbling walls and windows that seemed like black, staring eyes. Vines had snaked their way across the facade, as if trying to strangle the life out of it. As they stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned beneath their feet. Emily turned on her camera, the red recording light blinking steadily. "We're inside the Ashwood House," she whispered. "This place hasn't been touched in years." The front door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. The smell of rot and mildew hit them immediately. Paint peeled off the walls, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. Yet, there was something else, a faint, coppery smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Let's start with the living room," Mike suggested, already moving ahead. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old furniture covered in white sheets. As Emily panned the camera, she noticed something unusual, a fleeting shadow crossing the hallway behind them. "Did you guys see that?" she asked, her voice tense. "See what?" Mike turned, but there was nothing there. Sarah's pulse quickened. She could have sworn she heard soft footsteps on the creaky floorboards. The more they explored, the more unsettling the house became. They found old photographs on a mantelpiece, depicting a family of 5, smiling, yet somehow cold and distant. Sarah picked up a photo and examined it closely. The eyes of the children seemed almost lifelike, following her wherever she moved. In a dusty corner, they discovered a bundle of old newspaper clippings. The headlines told a chilling tale. "Family vanishes without a trace." "Mystery of the Ashwood House, no clues found." "Strange symbols found in basement." Sarah's heart sank as she read. The Anderson family had disappeared in 1965. The case had baffled authorities. Rumors of occult practices and strange symbols found in the basement were quickly hushed up. "We have to find the basement," Emily said, her curiosity piqued. The entrance to the basement was hidden beneath a rotting rug in the dining room. The wooden trapdoor was heavy, its hinges rusted from years of neglect. A foul-smelling draft wafted up as they pried it open. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked, peering into the darkness below. Mike grinned. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out." The narrow staircase led them into a cold, damp cellar. Strange symbols were etched into the stone walls, symbols that none of them recognized. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and strange markings. Emily moved closer, her camera trained on the chest. "What do you think is inside?" "Only one way to find out," Mike said, reaching for the lid. As soon as his fingers touched it, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. The air grew colder, and the light from their flashlights flickered. "Who did that?" Emily shouted, spinning around. A low whisper filled the room, growing louder and more insistent. It was a language they couldn't understand, but the tone was clear, angry and demanding. Panic set in. Mike pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah clutched her flashlight, her breath coming in short gasps. "We need to get out of here," she cried. The whispering grew louder, almost like a chant. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, Gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. His feet never touched the ground as he floated toward them. Emily screamed, dropping her camera. The figure reached out, its fingers elongated and blackened, like charred wood. In a surge of adrenaline, Mike grabbed a heavy piece of wood and swung it at the door. It cracked open, and they bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. They stumbled out of the house, gasping for air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. "We're never going back in there," Mike said, his face pale. Emily picked up her camera, but the screen was blank. Every clip they had recorded inside the house was gone. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man from the basement, his twisted grin etched into her mind. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Objects in her apartment moved on their own. Doors opened and closed without reason. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., she heard a whisper outside her window, a voice calling her name. Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to the town library. She found an old journal belonging to a former resident of Ashwood. The journal detailed the dark history of the house, the Anderson family's descent into madness, their experiments with summoning spirits, and the terrible price they paid. "The house is alive," the final entry read. "It feeds on fear. Once it marks you, it will never let you go." Sarah realized with growing horror that they had awoken something that couldn't be stopped. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a predator. The story ends with Sarah recording one last video, her face pale and gaunt. If you're watching this, please, never go near the Ashwood house. It's waiting for you, and once you enter, it will never let you leave. The Haunting of Blackwood Asylum. Blackwood Asylum was a place whispered about in town since anyone could remember. Built in 1922, it was initially a facility for patients suffering from severe mental illnesses. But over time, the asylum became infamous for its cruel practices and mysterious disappearances. Patients spoke of shadowy figures, strange voices at night, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. By 1975, a scandal broke out when 5 patients and 2 staff members were found dead under unexplained circumstances. The asylum was shut down immediately, and Blackwood was abandoned. No official investigation could explain what happened, but rumors spread like wildfire. It was haunted by the spirits of those who died there, their souls trapped within its crumbling walls. Years later, a group of 5 paranormal enthusiasts, Jessica, Ben, Mark, Claire, and Ethan, decided to document the haunting of Blackwood Asylum for their YouTube channel. Known for exploring abandoned and supposedly haunted places, the team was eager to capture definitive proof of the supernatural. Jessica, the leader of the group, was determined. "This could be our biggest investigation yet," she told the others as they stood outside the rusting gates of Blackwood. "Or our last," Ethan muttered, eyeing the looming building. Its broken windows resembled empty eye sockets, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. "Come on, guys, it's just an old building," Ben said with a forced laugh, trying to hide his nerves. "Let's get inside before it gets dark." The group entered through a side door, the metal groaning as it swung open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Long-forgotten medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti and peeling paint. Claire held up the EMF detector, watching for spikes in electromagnetic activity. "We're getting some readings already," she said, her voice tense. Jessica turned on her voice recorder. "If there are any spirits here, we'd like to communicate. Please give us a sign." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a loud bang echoed down the hallway. "Maybe it's just the wind," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty corridors. As they moved deeper into the asylum, the temperature seemed to drop. and the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. The group found themselves in the children's ward, a place that even the asylum staff had once feared. Stories of ghostly laughter and the sound of small footsteps were common among those brave enough to visit. Jessica scanned the room with her flashlight. Tiny beds stood in neat rows, their metal frames rusting. A decaying teddy bear sat in one corner, its button eyes missing. Suddenly, Claire gasped, "Did you hear that?" A soft giggle echoed through the room, sending chills down their spines. "There's no way that was an echo," Ethan whispered, gripping his camera tighter. Ben pointed toward the far end of the ward. "Look." A shadow moved across the doorway, too small to be an adult. It lingered for a second, then disappeared. Determined to find more evidence, the group decided to explore the basement, a part of the asylum that had been sealed off for decades. It was rumored that the most disturbed patients had been kept there, subjected to brutal experiments that the public never knew about. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and something far worse. Their flashlights barely pierced the darkness. Mark noticed something strange on the wall, symbols carved into the stone. Unlike anything they had ever seen. "These don't look like graffiti," he said. "They look like ritual symbols." Jessica took a closer look. What kind of rituals were they performing down here? The temperature plummeted, and suddenly, the lights on all their devices began to flicker. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Now." But as they turned to head back upstairs, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic set in. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. "Who's there?" Jessica called, trying to keep her voice steady. The only response was the sound of footsteps circling them, slow, deliberate. Ethan's camera caught something on its infrared setting. "There's something moving," he said, his hands shaking. A figure appeared on the screen, a tall, shadowy form with hollow eyes and an impossibly wide grin. It stood just behind Ben, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and the group was left with only the sound of their own panicked breathing. Using the faint light from their phones, they found another door at the back of the basement. It led to a smaller room, one that had clearly been used for something far darker than medical treatment. In the center of the room was a circle of symbols, surrounded by burnt candles. Bones, too large to be from animals, were scattered around the floor. Jessica realized with growing horror that they had stumbled upon the site of a ritual. "This isn't just a haunted asylum," she said. "This place is a gateway." Suddenly, the chanting returned, louder, more insistent. The air seemed to thicken, and shadows began to take form around them. Desperate, the group sprinted back toward the stairs. The door that had once been sealed was now wide open, but the shadows followed them, their distorted forms clawing at the air. Ben tripped and fell, but Ethan grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet. "Come on, we're almost there." They burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The asylum loomed behind them, silent once more. Jessica turned back, her heart racing. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing in the window, watching them. The group returned home, shaken but relieved to be alive. They reviewed their footage, but much of it was corrupted, except for one clip. In it, the shadowy figure from the basement stared directly into the camera, its mouth moving as if to speak. A single word could be heard: "Stay." Over the following weeks, strange things began happening. Claire woke up with scratches on her arms. Ethan's electronics malfunctioned constantly. Jessica received phone calls with nothing but static on the other end. They realized that they hadn't just encountered ghosts, they had brought something back with them. The ghost of Ravenhill Road. Ravenhill Road had a reputation that no one in the nearby town dared to ignore. The road twisted and turned through dense woods, its asphalt cracked and worn, with no streetlights to guide the way at night. Legend had it that a woman named Elizabeth Ward had been killed there in the 1950s. She was driving home late at night when her car skidded off the road and into the ravine below. They found her car a week later, but her body was never recovered. Since then, drivers have reported seeing her ghostly figure, dressed in white, standing by the roadside, silently watching. Some say she's trying to hitch a ride back home. Others believe she's seeking revenge, luring unsuspecting drivers to the same fate she suffered. It was a chilly autumn night when Jack, Sarah, and Ryan decided to test their courage by driving down Ravenhill Road at midnight. The air was thick with fog, and the full moon cast an eerie glow on the deserted road. "I still think this is a stupid idea," Sarah said, crossing her arms as she sat in the passenger seat. "We've heard all the stories. People disappear on this road." Jack, the self-proclaimed skeptic, laughed. "Come on, it's just an old urban legend. There's no such thing as ghosts." Ryan, sitting in the backseat, leaned forward. "So, if you're so brave, why don't you stop the car if we see her?" Jack grinned. "Deal." They drove in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the tires crunching against the gravel. The fog grew thicker as they climbed the hill, and the surrounding woods seemed to close in on them. Then, they saw her. A woman in a white dress stood on the side of the road, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She didn't move as the car approached, just stood there, staring into the distance. Jack slowed the car. "Holy, you guys seeing this?" Sarah gripped his arm. "Don't stop. Keep driving." But Jack was already rolling down the window. "Hey, do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Ryan leaned out the window. "Maybe she's lost?" Without warning, the woman turned her head toward them, her eyes glowing an unnatural shade of red. "Drive," Sarah screamed. Jack slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped down the road. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman was gone. They drove in silence for several minutes, their hearts racing. "What the hell was that?" Ryan finally said, his voice trembling. Jack shook his head. "I don't know. It was probably just a trick of the light or something." Sarah turned to him, her face pale. "That wasn't a trick. She looked right at us." Jack tried to brush it off, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When they finally reached town, Jack dropped Sarah and Ryan off at their homes. As he drove back to his apartment, he noticed something strange. His rearview mirror was cracked, a single line running diagonally across the glass. He didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, Jack woke up feeling uneasy. His phone had multiple missed calls from Sarah and Ryan. "Hey, guys, what's up?" he said, calling Sarah back. "Jack, something's wrong," Sarah whispered. "There's someone outside my house." Jack sat up in bed. "What do you mean?" "It's her, the woman from the road. She's just standing there." Jack grabbed his keys. "I'm coming over. Stay inside." By the time he reached Sarah's house, the woman was gone, but Sarah's front door was wide open, and there were muddy footprints leading into her living room. Determined to get answers, the trio decided to dig into the history of Ravenhill Road. They visited the town's library, where an old newspaper archive revealed the full story of Elizabeth Ward. It turned out that Elizabeth had been fleeing from someone the night of her accident. Witnesses reported seeing another car following her, its headlights flashing aggressively, but no one ever identified the driver. Sarah frowned. What if she wasn't an accident victim? What if she was murdered? Jack nodded. And what if she's still trying to warn people? Convinced they needed to face the spirit to uncover the truth, they returned to Ravenhill Road that night, armed with flashlights and a voice recorder. The road was even darker and more foreboding than before. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. "Elizabeth Ward," Jack called out. "We know what happened to you. If you're here, show yourself." The temperature dropped suddenly, and a chilling wind swept through the trees. The voice recorder crackled to life. capturing a faint whisper, "Help me." Sarah's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, they saw her again, standing in the middle of the road. "Help you how?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking, but the woman didn't answer. She pointed toward the ravine below. The trio climbed down the steep embankment, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, they found the rusted remains of Elizabeth's car, half buried in dirt and leaves. But there was something else, a second car, hidden behind a cluster of trees. Jack wiped dirt off the license plate. This was the car that chased her. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. Someone didn't want her story to be told. Sarah whispered. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and a piercing scream echoed through the night. The figure of Elizabeth appeared once more, her eyes filled with desperation. "Run!" Ryan shouted. They scrambled up the hill, the sound of footsteps following them. They reached the road, gasping for breath. The spirit of Elizabeth stood at the edge of the woods, watching them. For a moment, it seemed like she smiled, a sad, knowing smile, before fading into the mist. The trio never spoke of that night again. But every year on the anniversary of Elizabeth's death, Jack makes sure to leave flowers at the side of the road. He knows she's still there, watching over the road, waiting for the truth to be fully revealed. The Curse of St. Mary's Church. St. Mary's Church stood at the edge of an overgrown forest, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time. The stained glass windows were shattered, and ivy had crept up its stone walls, wrapping the building in a green shroud. The locals avoided it, refusing to speak of what happened there. For generations, it had been a place of whispers and fear. Some said they could hear the cries of the dead echoing through the trees at night. Others believed that anyone who entered the church would be cursed, doomed to suffer the same fate as the congregation that had perished within its walls. It was this dark legend that drew Emily, Jake, and Rachel to the church one cold October evening. "This is going to be epic," Jake said, adjusting his camera, "the perfect addition to our ghost hunting channel." Rachel, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes. "It's just an old church. Probably nothing more than rats and creaky floorboards." Emily, however, felt a strange heaviness in her chest as she gazed at the building. "We should be careful," she warned. "There's something wrong about this place." The group stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Dust particles danced in the beams of their flashlights. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something metallic and sharp. The interior of the church was a decaying shell of its former self. The pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Jake pointed his camera at the altar. "This is where it supposedly happened," he said. "The priest lost his mind and killed the entire congregation before taking his own life." Rachel scoffed. "That's just a story." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they explored further, strange things began to happen. Rachel's flashlight flickered, and then went out completely. "Great," she muttered, tapping it against her hand. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the church, causing all three to jump. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide. Jake swung his camera around, but the lens only captured shadows and dust. "Probably something falling. Old buildings make weird noises." But Emily wasn't convinced. The sound hadn't come from the ceiling or the walls, it had come from below. They found the entrance to the basement hidden behind the altar, a trapdoor that groaned in protest as they pried it open. A set of stone steps led down into darkness. "Are we really doing this?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Jake grinned. "Come on, this is what we came for." The basement was colder than the church above, the air damp and heavy. Their flashlights illuminated strange symbols carved into the stone walls, symbols none of them recognized. "This is getting weird," Emily said, running her fingers over one of the symbols. It felt warm to the touch, almost like it was alive. A sudden gust of wind blew through the basement, extinguishing their lights. In the pitch-black darkness, they heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice echoing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Jake managed to relight his flashlight, its beam shaking as he scanned the room. In the far corner, something glinted, a small, silver crucifix half buried in the dirt. Emily picked it up, her hand trembling. This must have belonged to one of the parishioners. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around them. The air grew thicker, and the walls felt like they were pressing inward. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned to go back up the stairs, the trapdoor slammed shut. Panic set in. They pounded on the trapdoor, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature plummeted, and their breath came out in white puffs. Then, the voices started, soft at first, like distant whispers. "Join us." Rachel clutched Emily's arm. "What the hell is happening?" Jake aimed his camera at the center of the room, where a figure began to materialize, a translucent man in a tattered priest's robe, his eyes hollow and lifeless. The priest raised a bony hand, pointing directly at them. "You cannot leave," he intoned, desperate. Jake swung his flashlight at the trapdoor, breaking the lock. The three scrambled up the stairs, tripping over each other in their rush to escape. When they burst outside, the air was sharp and cold, the night eerily silent. They ran without looking back, their hearts pounding in their chests. It wasn't until they reached the safety of their car that they dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" Rachel gasped. "I don't know," Jake said, his hands shaking, "but we caught it on camera." Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Jake's camera malfunctioned, erasing all the footage from that night. Emily started hearing whispers in her apartment at night, and Rachel woke up with scratches on her arms. They tried to move on, but the church wouldn't let them. Emily was the first to disappear. Her car was found abandoned near the church, but there was no sign of her. Then Rachel started seeing shadows in her home, dark shapes that moved when she wasn't looking. Jake knew they had to go back, armed with holy water and a determination to end the curse. Jake returned to St. Mary's. The church was waiting for him. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of decay. The priest's ghost stood at the altar, his hollow eyes glowing. "You cannot stop this," the ghost said. "They belong to me now." Jake threw the holy water, and the ghost let out a piercing scream. The church trembled, the walls cracking and crumbling. But as the dust settled, the ghost was gone, and so was the church.